Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our Quick Publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Podcasting to you from a field in beautiful rural Ireland, I'm Trev Downey, and this is On the Books, for which I'm joined as ever by Dave Hendrick. Dave, today we're going to talk about Provided You Don't Kiss Me, 20 Years with Brian Clough by Duncan Hamilton. John Motson refers to it as one of the best football books I've ever read. In the cover here, I have to say I actually just love even the look of this book. It's a proper football book, packed with info, packed with anecdotes. And I look forward to chatting with you about it. Before we do anything else, man, I suppose because of the subject matter, because of the person on whom we're going to be focusing so much of our attention today, Brian Clough, we should probably address the elephant in the room when it comes to Liverpool fans. And I'm aware that it won't be just Liverpool fans who are listening to this, but it will be predominantly. And, you know, to say that Brian Clough's reaction to the Hillsborough disaster was problematic would be a massive, massive understatement. He parroted the accepted views that were pushed out by mass media and government, and he was overtly courting that controversy. I saw an interview with him recently from about 95 time. I think his autobiography came out in 94. He's talking to Clive Anderson, and he's doubling down on the fact that, you know, it was Liverpool fans' fault and they were to blame for what had happened. And it has made a real dog's dinner of any sort of ability most Liverpool fans have had to reflect on Clough in anything other than a sort of a jaundiced fashion, you'd have to say. And I think that's absolutely fair enough. Another thing I just want to mention before I let you at it is, you know, I was looking at a Guardian article there. I think it was very recent, actually. Phil Scratton, who everybody will know, has been quite eloquent about all things Hillsborough. He's writing about that man himself, about Brian Clough and his reaction, and he doubles down and says, look, you know, because Clough was such a personality, he was beyond football. He was spitting image. He was Parkinson, you know, he was a sort of an institution in and of himself because of his big mouth, his self-admitted big mouth, his nickname Old Big Head, that he actually cultivated as well. And he liked to be loud and he liked to be controversial. And as we look at him later on, we'll find that he's a terribly insecure man. And at this moment, when he's doing all this talking, he is absolutely in the throes of alcoholism. And it's really got a hold of him at this stage of his life. But, you know, this article by Scratton just says, you know, for someone like Brian Clough talking about that, it really feeds into public perception, and it had a very damaging effect that lasted for a long time. You'd have to say, Dave, that it's very important that we do just acknowledge that side of things before we get cracking with the book.
Yeah, it's absolutely important that it's mentioned because it does shape how many people viewed Brian Clough. Brian Clough was, like you said, a huge personality. Like, you look at the two defining managers in English football from the 70s. Well, probably the three defining managers, the 70s and the 80s, Bill Shankly, Bob Paisley and Brian Clough. From a personality standpoint, that sort of almost cult of personality, Shankly and Clough are similar, not in how they went about their business, but just in the fact that they were both outspoken, both well-known socialists, lifelong campaigners. Clough was a big supporter of the miners. He donated large sums of money to unions, and I think he was the chairman of the Anti-Nazi League. He constantly fought for the little guy, but you're absolutely right, he bought into the media narrative that had been spun around Hillsborough. And it wasn't just him, obviously. There's an awful lot of people that did, from famous people like Clough to the man on the street, because that's what they were told had happened. They weren't there. He was there. He was there, but obviously his focus was on the game at the time. He didn't know what was going on outside. And he bought into what he was told. And it wasn't just by the media. Like you mentioned, it was by the government. This was something the government pushed. This was a cover-up that started at the very highest level, from Margaret Thatcher all the way down. And the tabloid journalists, the gutter journalists, they all fed into that, and they did the bidding of a Tory government who had already shown years prior to Hillsborough they were anti-Liverpool. Not just club, obviously, but city. They were anti-Scousers. They talked about, the managed decline of Liverpool.
Yeah.
So when this happened, it was almost like Thatcher and her cabinet thought they'd won the lottery. Now we have something to hammer them with. Now we have a reason to let them rot. And unfortunately, Brian Clough, who was about as famous as any Englishman was through the 70s, 80s and 90s, parroted what he had heard. Now, to give him his due, in 2001 he did come out and say that he had been misinformed, he bought into the misinformation. He said, "I now accept the investigations have made me realise I was misinformed. I wasn't trying to be vindictive or unsympathetic, but my opinion has altered over the years. It was never my intention to hurt anyone." Now, it's all well and good him saying that. The facts are he was vindictive, he was unsympathetic, and he did hurt people. But like you mentioned, this is a guy who, through the 80s, and obviously it ramped up in the 90s, was a functioning alcoholic. And this book that we're going to talk about is probably the book that really lifted the lid and opened a lot of people's eyes to the extent of Clough's addiction. Because in his own autobiographies, in the first one, he kind of brushes over it. In the second one, he talks a bit more openly about it. But at the same time, he doesn't admit to alcoholism. He doesn't see himself as an alcoholic. He sees himself as someone that just drinks too much. But it was really when this book came out, and Duncan Hamilton, who'd spent so much time with him and knew him so well and knew his mannerisms and knew his tics and his twitches, Duncan Hamilton was really the one that lifted the lid on it. And I think one of the reasons that he waited to write this book until after Brian Clough had died was that he didn't want to hurt Clough, because he had to tell the story. Brian Clough's story can't be told without explaining that side of things. So he had to tell that story. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been doing his job as a journalist. But I think that's part of the reason he waited for Clough to pass away and then began to write the book, and was very open about, his own experiences with Clough and the changes in his personality. And all of that factors into a manager who had a love of the attention. Like you said, this guy was on Parkinson. Parkinson was where George Best went, and Muhammad Ali, and the biggest stars. It wasn't somewhere where a football manager went. Bob Paisley was not going to go on Parkinson. But Clough loved being the centre of attention. Clough was the Jose Mourinho of his era. Outspoken, outlandish, the biggest star in the room, the biggest ego at the club. And when a microphone was put in front of him, it was like his brain turned off and his mouth just went on autopilot. And he would just talk and talk and talk. And he would say things like what he said about Hillsborough, that were just at the front of his conscience, but weren't things he'd necessarily thought deeply about, and he wasn't stopping himself to correct any part of that stream of conscience. He was just letting go whatever was in his head in response to specific questions. And unfortunately, it does tarnish the legacy of a man who's, after Bob Paisley, arguably the greatest English manager of all time.
And that's something that we have to lean into, because that's what we're doing here, is we're examining a book about a guy whose achievements are, they're absolutely unique. You could see somebody making a very valid case for how what Clough did is possibly the most impressive thing that any English manager or British manager has ever done. And I could sit in a room and listen to someone make that argument, because it is stunning. His career achievements are stunning. And, I think it's good that we got that sort of thing out of the way, especially in the context of his eventual acceptance of the fact that he was wrong, because this is very much what Brian Clough is. The more you read Duncan Hamilton's book, the more you read about him, but Duncan Hamilton's book is sort of searingly honest portrait of him. And as you said, I think it's important. Yeah, it's a good point you make that this wins the William Hill Prize in 2007, and the man himself is gone at this stage. He died at 69, Dave, and that speaks as much as anything else to the effects, the ravages of alcohol. Anyone remembers Clough in the 90s, in the late 80s into the 90s will remember. And by the time the Premier League comes around, he's an absolute wreck of a human, yes. Shambling about in his green jumper on the sideline, just too big to be sacked, that kind of thing. But my God, you could see the ravages of alcohol on him. And I'm thinking 69. I'm thinking in a week where my old man at 78 is after throwing himself off the top of a ladder where he was hopping about on a roof. You just think, my God, what a waste. Especially that mind, Dave. Because whatever you say about him, and he was capable of pettiness and terrible, nasty comments. But he's also a funny bastard, and he was very clever, very witty. And
the thing to remember about him, Trev, as well, is he dies at 69. He's been gone from Forest almost 11 years at that point.
I know, man.
So that's shocking. 58. Jurgen Klopp is 54. Brian Clough was only 4 years older than him when his tenure at Forest came to an end. And like you said, he was a shell of a human being for the last 4 or 5 years there. Even back into the 80s, Forest had a bit of success at the end of the 80s. But you could still see his face got bloated, he got very red in the face, his nose expanded. And he went from a guy who was a notoriously sharp dresser. You go back and look at pictures of Clough in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And that is a man always in a suit. That is a man sharply dressed. And then you see him and he's wearing a pair of shorts, a rugby jersey with a green jumper over it. And he was walking around with a tennis racket for no reason at all other than he wanted to carry the tennis racket around himself. And in his own mind, it all made sense to him. It makes no sense to me. And that, it does just speak to how that addiction took hold of him. Yeah. But this guy, I would make the argument, I would sit and make the argument that what Brian Clough did at Derby and at Forest are among the greatest achievements anyone has ever done. So he takes over Derby, and they're a second division club. He wins the second division, he brings them up into the top flight, and he wins the top flight league within 3 years. Then it all goes to hell in a handbasket because he starts, making outlandish demands and falls out with everybody, because that's what Brian Clough does. He goes to Brighton, it doesn't work. Goes to Leeds, it's a disaster. And obviously we have The Damned United as a result, which is a very good film, fiction based on fact rather than, factually based. And then he goes to Forest, and it's actually easier to picture what he took over at Forest now. A run-of-the-mill second-tier club, a small regional club, not going anywhere, no great history behind them, no great, former success to look back on. And Brian Clough goes there, and within 3 years, he takes them into the top flight. In his second year, he takes them into the top flight. I think they finished runners-up in Division 2. In his first year in the top flight, he won the league title. And then he won back-to-back European Cups. So just imagine Steve Cooper, who's currently the manager of Forest that we played last weekend, getting them promoted this season, winning the Premier League next season, and then going on to win back-to-back European Cups in the 2 seasons after that. And that was at a time when Liverpool were arguably the best team in the world. There was an Aston Villa team being built that would go on and win a European Cup. There was a Tottenham team that were very competitive. There was a competitive Arsenal team. Like, it wasn't like he came up into a very weak top flight. He came up with sharks all round, won it at the first time of asking, and then won back-to-back European Cups. To this day, they're the only club with more European Cups than domestic league titles. And if you take a look at the European Cup winners, you go right the way down. So you go Real Madrid, Bayern, AC Milan, Bayern Munich, Liverpool, Barcelona, Ajax, Manchester United, Inter Milan, Juventus, Benfica, Chelsea, Porto, Nottingham Forest. They're the clubs with 2 or more. Every single other one of those clubs is a massive club in a massive city. And even below that, Celtic, massive club, massive city. Hamburg, big club at the time, massive city. Steaua Bucharest, massive city. Marseille, mega rich at the time, massive city. Dortmund, big city. And at the time, arguably the best team in Europe because they had Zammer and all the makings of that German national team. Feyenoord, massive city, Rotterdam. Aston Villa, Birmingham's a very big city. PSV Eindhoven and Red Star Belgrade. Red Star, big city. Belgrade's a big city. And that's that great kind of Yugoslav team was all kind of there. PSV Eindhoven's the only other club you could look at and say, that's a smaller club from a small city that overcame all the giants. Forest did it twice. There's absolutely no, there's no blueprint for that. Nobody has ever come close to repeating it.
No, which is why I said what I said, and I'm glad to hear that you agree, because obviously I'm a very proud Liverpool fan like yourself, and Bob Paisley to me is a terribly underrated man. But we do have to just, caps need to be removed when you're talking about the achievements of this guy, because, and again we're going to get into the book in a second, but like again just for a little bit of context on what Dave's taking you through there at that timeline. He gets his first job when he's 34. Now think about that, right? He has to retire prematurely. He's a wonderfully excellent, brilliant, possibly generationally good footballer. Then he has to retire. He gets his job at Hartlepool at 34. Him and Peter Taylor get together there. So 34, that's in 1965. He gets the Derby manager job at 36. He wins the second division championship at 38. And he has won the first division championship, the top league, at 41. And all of his contemporaries, man, they're old men. And not only are they old men by comparison, they're old men in the 70s who look like old men. They're middle-aged men in the 70s who look like old men. They're all in their 50s, the likes of Bill Shankly and the likes of that. The only one who's comparable in age is Don Revie. And Don Revie looked about 10 years older than he was. So Clough is this kind of weird force of nature who's doing things, ridiculous things, at a very young age. And that little thing that you pointed out about how young he was when he finished and the comparison with what Jurgen is now, that's really stunning. And if you go back a couple of years again to, the late 80s, 89, when we're talking about that Hillsborough Cup, this cup semi-final, and look at him there, and he's just a wreck of a human. It's really, really stunning to think about.
So to remember about the start of his career is, like you said, he was 34 getting that Hartlepool job. They were in the 4th division. And within 7 years, he's winning the 1st division. Like, that's the level that he moved himself up that quickly from the 4th division. A club who were finishing bottom of the fourth division most years before he got there and had to continually reapply to get back into the Football League. He goes there, makes a big impression, does really well, jumps 2 divisions to go to Derby, then takes them up, and then he's off to the races. And like that first 7 years of his career, just to go from bottom of the fourth division to top of the first division in 7 years, that's remarkable, let alone what he did after that. Like, this is a guy who was a managerial savant. Like, we need to be very clear about this. This is a genius, a football genius that we're talking about here.
Exactly, which is why Duncan Hamilton's book, which focuses, as it says in the title, on 2 decades, in the most close confines you can possibly imagine with a man. Hamilton says at one stage in the book that if he adds up all the time that he spent with him, buses, in offices, hanging around on training pitches, watching reserve matches, you do all the sums, he said it comes to about a couple of years that he spent in Clough's company. That's remarkable. That is a very intense relationship. And that's why this is such an interesting and one-off book. And, you know, I was very, very taken by the concept of the book, which is why I picked it up. I was not expecting the joy that Hamilton's a very good writer as well. That's always an added bonus. And I love the way that he writes. He's got tremendous gift with the language. He's very, very expressive writer. And it makes it all the more sort of intense because this portrait is a portrait written by a man who was regularly harangued and harassed and called it every kind of shithouse under the sun, barred and banned, told to get the hell out. You know, there's a brilliant passage in the book where the lads are in the dressing room it's another dressing down for poor old Duncan based on what he wrote at the weekend in front of all the lads as they're tugging in the showers, all the rest of it. And they're all kind of looking at them askance, doing little winces and kind of hanging in their buddy looks. And the queer fella's giving it the full hairdryer treatment, blows himself out. And a couple of days later, actually, Hamilton gets a phone call and it's like, all right, shithouse, where have you been? And it's, you know, it's like, well, you banned me, Brian. I did. It was all just in the moment. It's all forgotten. Come on down and we'll have a drink of champagne and we'll put it all to right. You know, this is the kind of
thing.
What a gift for a reporter that is.
That's the thing, and that's one of the things that has been lost in football journalism. I mean, you, like I, be a big fan of Brian Glanville and the great writers of the 70s, 80s and 90s who had just a level of access and a level of relationship with managers that it's impossible for them to have now. And the thing I love about how Duncan Hamilton writes this book is he's very self-deprecating.
Yeah.
He doesn't try and, like, he's telling you as he writes the book how fortunate he feels he was to witness this genius, but he's also, he never tries to distract from the story with his own kind of story that he's telling parallel to it. And he's not hiding the warts of Brian Clough either. He's being brutally honest about everything. And I mean, it starts, the title of the first chapter and the opening line of what Brian Clough ever said to him kind of surmises the entire relationship and how it would go. And that was just Brian Clough. Like, I remember when I picked it up, like you flick through it and you kind of go to chapter 1 and you read the first couple of lines and you're just standing there going like, imagine there's a new reporter for the Echo, new chief football writer for the Echo, assigned to Liverpool Football Club. They go down to the training ground and Jurgen Klopp meets them like this. Like, that's front page news everywhere. And that's going to just blow back massively if anything like that ever happened. You couldn't do it now.
Did you actually say the line? No,
I didn't say the line because I know you went through the first.
No. I'm going to do the prologue, man. I'm going to do.
You're going to do the prologue. Perfect. Yeah. So the first chapter is just called "Who the fuck are you then?" Yeah. Brian Clough Duncan Hamilton walks into the City Ground and Brian Clough looks at him and says, "Who the fuck are you?" And he stumbles and bumbles his name, and then he says, "And what paper do you write for?" And he tells him the name of the paper, and he's stammering and he can't get his words out. And that's it. That's the birth of a relationship that lasts up until Brian Clough's death. And you can tell that it wasn't just... You can tell that the respect and the admiration was both-sided, because if Brian Clough didn't care about Duncan Hamilton, if Brian Clough didn't value what he said, he would never have given him the dressing downs. He wouldn't have spoken to him. He would have acted like he didn't exist, because he did that with other reporters. There's other reporters from that time who are still very bitter about the fact that Brian Clough never spoke to them because he didn't value their opinions, didn't value their work. And they could write whatever they want, and he'd just continue to ignore them, or he'd make a sarky comment to some other journalist. But he wouldn't approach them in the way he did. He did this in a dressing room. Like, the journalists don't get into the dressing room these days. They don't get anywhere close to the dressing room. There's designated media areas. This is the man who could walk into the dressing room and just sit down and talk to a player. That's the level of access he had. And it's what gives you the idea of how close he was to Clough. And the other thing is, before you go into the prologue, it's not just the time he spent with Clough. It's also the time he got to spend with Peter Taylor.
Yes.
Because Peter Taylor obviously is a big part of the Clough story. And if anyone hasn't read it, his own book, With Clough by Taylor, is brilliant. But it's the book that eventually kind of killed the relationship between these two men. And like, he would also hear from Peter Taylor when Clough was doing something mental, when Clough had done something outlandish or said something. And so he wasn't just witnessing it, he was a confidant of multiple people around Brian Clough. So that's how you know he has sort of a full spectrum view of Clough. It's not one-sided. As I said earlier, he hasn't tried to hide the warts. He has very much written... An expose would be the wrong word, but you know what I mean. He has basically laid out who Brian Clough was and what the experience was like to be with Brian Clough for 20 years.
And Clough had kind of given him the imprimatur to do it when it didn't matter. He says, you might as well hang around, was kind of the gist of it, and hear things. I think Hamilton says at one stage, the Clough promised me tell him everything. And he says, well, that's not strictly true. He basically said he told me 90% of the stuff 85% of the time or something like that. But, again, that's a remarkable level of extra info that most people have. I really like that point you're making about Peter Taylor as well, because tremendously underrated in terms of those achievements. We were just talking about Nottingham Forest, and I didn't bring him up, and we should have, because you talked about Duncan Hamilton there. It's like he's caught between mom and dad. They often talk about the Clough-Taylor arrangement as being like a marriage. They'd have these cycles of, love, hate, and all the rest of it, dependence on each other. Clough had the good sense to pick a man who could do something, a man who he could get on with, who could do something that he couldn't. And this is, I think, perhaps a failing of an awful lot of other managers over the years, and possibly a strong point of our own. You see Jurgen Klopp very good at surrounding himself with people who are good at things that perhaps Jurgen acknowledges he's not. Clough hit on that early on, and it was kind of, let's be honest, Dave, it was kind of revolutionary concept. You know what I mean? And it had a massive, massive impact on the success, because Taylor was sort of notoriously good at seeing a player and knowing what a good player was, and then Clough would
negotiating deals.
Yes, exactly. And then Clough would do his coaching managerial combo that he did that seemed to inspire lads. Well, certainly it did inspire them in the early stages. There is a fantastic little piece. I might as well talk about this now just before we get into it. There's a fantastic little piece where Hamilton's talking about going to youth games with Clough, and the opposition players were so terrified, because the thing about Clough was he was always the loudest man in the room. And he had this, it was weird because he was a very overtly macho personality. And yet, I don't know what you thought, but I always thought he came across as a little bit, it was almost like he was a bit of a mincer, you know? He had a sort of a, kind of twist to his voice. It was a little bit, he had a little
bit of a campness to his voice.
A little bit of a little bit of a camp, Kenneth Williams carry on sort of, kind of thing to his voice. But at the same time, he was sort of ferociously old-fashioned, macho, masculine attitude. We must talk later on, if we get a chance, about his relationship with Justin Fashanu. That's massively interesting.
Yes, it is.
But
the thing with Peter Taylor is, like, Peter Taylor was his assistant manager, but Peter Taylor, in many ways, was like the first sporting director in English football. He was the chief scout. He was the negotiator. Clough would only really be brought in if a player needed convincing. Clough would come in and sit down with him. Now, as things got worse later in his career and the drink took hold, there are some miraculous stories about things that Brian Clough did while trying to convince players to sign for Nottingham Forest. And they're not things that are part of this book, but you'll find stories like that from, former players and that talking on, other podcasts and on YouTube and stuff. But Taylor did all of that. And like you said, Taylor was the guy that when a player got a dressing down, or a player was being left out in the cold, or a player felt like he couldn't get on with the manager, Taylor was the buffer. Taylor was the one that would go in and put his arm around the shoulder. Clough was the stick. Taylor was the carrot. And it was a relationship and a partnership that worked brilliantly. And we've seen it with other managers. Like, there are other managers like Clough who have that heavy reliance on an assistant like this. For example, I don't think Rafa Benitez has ever been the same since he and Paco Ayerstein split. I don't think Mourinho's been the same since he and Rui Faria split. I think sometimes these managers who operate at such a high level, they need someone that they can bounce thoughts off of constantly. They need someone that they can trust implicitly. And when Taylor and Clough split for the final time, that was basically it. I mean, Forest would win a couple of League Cups late in the 90s, but Clough was never the same after Taylor left in 82. Never the same guy. Never the same manager. Kind of lost some of that spark as well. Like that ferociousness that you mentioned, that was just this inner fire that burned in him. And he was, I don't know if you've ever seen The Last Dance with Michael Jordan, where Jordan talks about, needing that little bit of extra edge. So he would wait for someone to say or do something minuscule, and he would blow it up in his mind that person had slighted him. Yeah. So he talks about they're playing Seattle in the NBA Finals, and George Karl comes in, doesn't see Jordan, and goes and sits at another table, and Jordan thinks, well, he's just snubbed me. Or he was playing a game against someone, and he just decided that person had said something about him, and he used it as a point of anger. With Brian Clough, there's the Don Revie incident when he's at Derby. Derby are in the second division. Leeds are top of the league. Revie is probably the number one English manager at the time. This would be the days, obviously, before Bob Paisley. Shankly was the Liverpool manager. So Revie was the top dog in English football from an English point of view. And he was the guy Clough was in awe of. Clough looked up to this guy. He wanted Clough, or he wanted Revie to come to Derby and see a real club, a club that was well run, a club that was a fine-oiled machine the way Leeds were. And Revie snubbed him. And Clough used that as that fire to get into the first division and then win the first division to beat that Leeds giant. And then it was the driving force in his decision to go to Leeds, obviously, which turned out to be a disaster for him. But then he was able to use that failure at Leeds and how the Leeds players slighted him and how they turned on him. And he went to Forest with that. And he always had those little angles that he'd play, even with himself, just that little bit of extra motivation that he could get for himself that would fuel the genius and the spark behind him. And that's what made him special. And then he had Taylor there sort of as the buffer to stop him going over the cliff. When you see like a child running down the road full blast, and you're like, that kid's going to run out in front of a car, and then you realise the mother has a set of reins on them. Well, Peter Taylor was standing behind Brian Clough with a set of reins on him to stop him doing himself a damage, you know?
They were badly needed as well, and there's a lovely passage or a couple of pages in the book as well about when Clough finds out that Taylor has passed. He died, I think, only a youngish man as well. I think he was only 62 in 1990, and Clough is utterly shattered. They haven't spoken for 7 years, and immediately the regret and the remorse kicks in, and this is why you understand that there is a little bit more to this guy than the bluster and the sort of by the time it's the mid to late 80s, he's almost buffoonish, but there's more to him than that kind of loudmouth. Because he's instantly on his own case, saying all it would have taken was me to pick up the phone, and 5 minutes later we'd have been fine, and it really, really ate him away. But the thing that I was saying about his loud mouth, that Hamilton goes into, is when he was watching those youth team games, the opposition players would be afraid of him. That's the kind of persona you're talking about. He would be barking in that voice of his from the sideline and saying all sorts. And Hamilton says the opposition players would genuinely not want to come over to where Clough was standing on the sideline. So he says entire games were played in midfield. You know what I mean? So that the opposition players wouldn't have to interact with him. And if and when a ball did go dead around where Brian happened to be standing, he said Brian used to run to get the ball, and he would ram it back at the opposition player right into his bollocks. And he'd laugh. He'd kind of look at Hamilton and go, keeps them on their toes, you know? This is the kind of individual we're chatting about here. But I want to get into, if we can, and you feel free later on to focus on a couple of bits here, but I want to just go into the prologue here, because in this prologue, Hamilton has given us all a little gift, because he's made me at least aware of a fellow called B.S. Johnson, who has a football book. Yeah, I call it a football book. It's based around football because he was a football reporter to make ends meet. And it's called The Unfortunates. Now, this book could be described as a kind of a modernist experiment. It's got 27 chapters, and bar the first and last, these can be read in any order. So the chapters are all in kind of little individual sort of, like either, not quite envelopes, but little separating things. And the idea was, for B.S. Johnson, his concept was he was trying to convey the arbitrary nature of thought, and he was using sport and sports reporting. Basically, it doesn't matter which day, it's all the same shit, is basically what B.S. Johnson was getting at. Now, this guy was a brilliant writer in and of himself, but he was also given to incredibly bleak, dark thoughts. You know, if you were to read that book, and I've read a couple of chapters that I found online, to say it's a bleak appraisal of the lot of a football reporter is an understatement. You know, it's a really, really interesting book that I think we might have to. I've ordered it today, and when I'm finished, I'm going to send it on up to you in your estate in Cavan there. And I think
I'm actually just ordering it now as you.
Good lad, because honestly, it looks absolutely fascinating, man. And you know, that sets us up, because that's Hamilton's segue into talking about his origins as a football writer. And now we're back into more sort of recognizable territory. We're talking about an era which obviously I'm going to remember a bit better being that bit older, but he was talking about, you know, basically what football reporting meant was about 60 to 100 games a year, deadlines, word counts. And, you know, he's relating to B.S. Johnson. He's saying it's very easy to get disillusioned doing stuff like that. And he's talking about how you have this real reliance on the Rothman's football yearbook. You know, it's really important to have that, you know, because you've got to check your facts and figures and stats and all that type of thing. And I think Johnson was pushing back against, the use of cliches. For example, he used this brilliant quote in The Unfortunates, where he's talking about the tabloid journalists. He refers to them as the heavy mob, and then the other lads, the likes perhaps of a budding Glanville, and he calls them the well-paid suits armed to the teeth with colour and metaphor. This guy is really bitter about the whole exercise. But I like what he's doing here because what Hamilton's doing here by showing us this and by exposing us to this and talking to us about Johnson's bleak view of the lot of a football reporter, is saying, it is a tough gig. And he says that he spent 17 years or so, 2 freelance agencies, 1 national paper, and the Nottingham Evening Post. And 1 season, I think it's his first season, he mentions that he was following not Notts Forest, Notts County, and their manager was a lad called Jimmy Cyril, a very dour Scot. There was a lot of dour Scots in football back then, and he refers to his year, very much inspired, I think, by Mr. Johnson and his book, The Unfortunate. He refers to his year following Notts County as like dropping into the 5th circle of Dante's hell. So, I mean, it's quite interesting. Cyril would give him nothing, like nothing. He didn't want to give quotes. He didn't want to engage with the press. He was just dour, bleak, no interest in any kind of communication. And I think, can you imagine then, Dave, the contrast? You rock up at Nottingham Forest and there's Clough, a veritable quote machine, who invites you into his office and starts pouring whiskey for you. And 2 or 3 or 4 hours later, you might get out. Your notepad is full. You're a bit locked. But wow, can you imagine the contrast there?
That's the thing. Like the fortune of one beat versus the fortune of another within the same city, to have these 2 guys. And if anyone's ever seen a picture of Meadow Lane, which is where Notts County play, and the City Ground, which is where Forest play, they're literally, you could kick a football from one and hit the other. And like, literally, you go one road and you've got this dour Scot who just does not want to speak to the media, doesn't want anything to do with anybody. And on the other side, like you said, you've just got this fella who, he wants to get drunk, so he's going to get you drunk because it's an excuse for him to get drunk. Like, the 2 of them managing in the same city as well, like, there'll obviously have been some sort of rivalry and back and forth between the 2 of them at different points, just because they're managing in the same city. And they could not be any different. Like, they really couldn't be any different as human beings. And if you got stuck at Notts County and your mate was over at Notts Forest talking to Clough and you were just getting ignored all day, I think you'd probably turn it in and go and get a job doing something else.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I mean, like, there's a fantastic little extract there. He talks about, Jimmy. He says, "Morning, Jim. Lovely day. If you think so, you write it," he'd reply. Or he'd say, "Good morning, Jim. Lovely day. Aye, but it's not if you're dead, is it, eh?" This is the kind of stuff you get from Cyril. And, he'd say, if Hamilton sort of put a hypothetical to Cyril, like, if your centre forward gets better in time, or if you were to play wingers, Cyril would go, "Aye, if my granny had a dickie, then she wouldn't be my granny." And that's basically the extent of poor old Duncan's output. Now, I want to read a little bit to you, Dave, if you don't mind, from the book, which I think is going to give people a feel for Duncan Hamilton as a writer, which is important because obviously I'm not going to recommend the book. You're not going to recommend the book. That isn't well written. That's kind of a very important part of what we're trying to do here. And in contrast to the very dour, bleak, grim Jimmy Cyril days, in contrast to B.S. Johnson and his very sort of bleak take on the world as well of football writing, he says, "I saw a lot of memorable matches, the matches that stay with you for the rest of your life." And I'm just going to read about a page and a half here of some of these moments that he brings to life for us. He says, "On an August night in Barcelona, after a downpour so intense that the rain seemed to hang from the sky like a single flat sheet. I saw the stubby-framed Diego Maradona perform juggling and conjuring tricks in a pre-season friendly. Maradona was 2 months short of his 24th birthday, and 3 years away from football immortality and notoriety the 1986 World Cup would guarantee him. I can still see him now. He sets off on a slanting 15-yard run across the Nou Camp, flicking the ball with the toe of his boot because it refuses to roll on the water-drenched surface. Like a one-man game of keepy-uppy, the white ball glistens under the lights as if it's been highly polished. 3 red-shirted defenders dive in and are casually beaten. The defenders turn in an open-mouthed incredulity at what's happened to them before setting off in fruitless pursuit, as if chasing a pickpocket down a street. But it's too late. Maradona reaches the box and, finishing his work with a flourish, he lifts the ball with his toe for the last time and volleys it into the net. He raises his left hand in a modest salute. It's the hand that will punch a goal past Peter Shilton, the hand that will eventually hold the World Cup. On successive Saturdays in September 1986, I saw Forest comprehensively dismantle the first Aston Villa, then Chelsea. This pair of results, 6-0 and 6-2, were beautifully described as looking on paper like a routine first-round match for Martina Navratilova. I saw Forest claw back a 2-goal deficit in the European Cup semi-final against Cologne on a ploughed field of a pitch. The city ground mud clung to the players' boots like glue, yet John Robertson, Gary Birtles and Tony Woodcock seemed to be running on silk. The match finished 3-3. A year later, in 1980, I saw Forest retain the European Cup on a May evening in Madrid against Hamburg. The air was heavy, the sky like glass. I remember afterwards briefly holding one of the handles of the silver trophy, reaching out for it the way a wide-eyed infant would stretch to touch a coloured bauble on a Christmas tree. I was there when Forest played West Ham at home at the end of the 85-86 season, and a Dutchman called Johnny Method, one of the players I regarded as a friend, hit the ball so hard that I thought it would burst. Method took the free kick to the right of the box, about 20 yards out. The ball appeared to me to travel in a straight rising line of white light before it filled the net. The crowd in stunned disbelief were mute for a moment, but then the noise began so loud it could have perforated eardrums. And each Saturday I saw the skills of John Robertson, the grace of Trevor Francis and Martin O'Neill, and I watched Peter Shilton save shots that looked unreachable for mere mortals. And that's just a little passage from the very first part of the book, from the prologue. Brings it to life beautifully, Dave. I mean, if you're interested in football, how can you not want to read more? How could you not be interested in more? And you know what's mad, man? That 85-86 season, one that was so important to me in my Liverpool supporting career, because Kenny Dalglish turned into Roy of the Rovers and player managered his way to a double. It's bananas stuff, the kind of stuff you couldn't have made it up. And in that season, I remember that Johnny Method shot. It was absolutely incredible. And Method stood out because he was a rare sort of tall, bald man. And he had a absolute belter of a right foot on him, and it was just just remembering that brought all those memories back to me. And I'm sure people listening to the Maradona passage as well. He conjures words beautifully. You'd have to say, Dave, to be fair, that is a real strength of the book, is Hamilton's ability to write very, very beautifully. He's actually a very talented writer, and that helps immeasurably, I think, when you're engaging with a topic like this.
Yeah, he's an outstanding writer, and I love how descriptive he is, and I love how he brings you into the book in that prologue. Like, it is really inviting. Like you say, how would you not want to read more? How would you pick this book up, read the prologue, and go, nah, not for me, and put it back down? Like, you'd have to read it. You'd have to know more. You'd have to read about these events, and he does a brilliant job. He's almost got like the knack of a fiction writer for making you want to read the next page, for making you want to read another chapter. You know, yeah. It is one of those type of books that just continues to draw you in, and at the end, you're A, very satisfied, but B, you're also left wanting a bit more. You're also left wanting more of these type of stories. You want to know more about certain things to do with Clough. You want more than he can tell you in a book. And that's the mastery of what Duncan Hamilton has crafted here. It's a sensationally written book. And his talent for storytelling is incredible. Like I mentioned with Brian Glanville, that was one of the things I always loved about Brian Glanville, was how he would marry talking about football with storytelling, and he'd link the two perfectly, and he'd draw you into a piece or a book to the point you just couldn't put it down.
It is a rare, unfortunately, and I speak as someone who spent a considerable number of years contributing to the greater body of football writing. It's something that is rare, where you pick up a piece and you go, tell you what, that's really beautifully put together. And it works as a football piece. Yeah, it told me about the match against Dortmund and the fact that Emre Can has an injury or whatever. But also, I'll tell you what, I got something out of that now I want to go and look it up or read more about it. And it's a rare thing. And I thought it was worth saying. And you mentioned the storytelling. Was there any particular thing? We might finish in a minute with another little extract. But was there anything in particular that you wanted to focus on, like from the various chapters that just you thought, okay, well, I've got to refer to this? Any little anecdote from it, or any specific little thing you wanted to draw attention to?
There's a couple of little bits. Chapter 3 is called "Don't Mention the War," and it starts off with them talking about, if Forest have just won the European Cup for the first time in 1979, and he asks Clough later, what were you thinking about in that moment as you looked around and you looked at the cup and you looked at your players? And, like Brian Clough won a league title with Forest, a league title with Derby, and 2 European Cups with Forest. He also, of course, won 4 League Cups. And you would think that those would be the trophies that would be special to him, but he refers back to winning the Anglo-Scottish Cup in 1977 and how, we've spoken about this before, how winning that trophy, getting the taste of silverware, can be a real driving force for players, and how getting that bit of success in 77 with like the Anglo-Scottish Cup, which nobody cared about, even at that time.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about. And Hamilton references in the book, Forest went and played those games in the final, and no one cared. There was 13,000 people at the home leg of the final and like 5,000 at the away leg. They were playing Leyton Orient. And the media coverage at that time was all focused on Liverpool, who'd gone out of the European Cup, and that was basically what I think they'd won the European Cup semi-finals or something, and that's where the media focus was, and Forest sort of won this thing under the radar, and then only 2 years later, they're lifting the European Cup with like 7 or 8 of the same players who'd been in the second division, won that trophy, gotten the taste of success, gotten themselves promoted at the same season, come up and won the league. And Clough believed that it all sparked with that Anglo-Scottish Cup. And we've obviously talked about it with the League Cup, how winning some silverware earlier in the season can be a great springboard to move forward from. And he also references in that same chapter how Clough, like I mentioned earlier on, how he would feel slighted by things and use them as a real driving force. When he was at Derby, he felt like they were cheated in the European Cup against Juventus. Very similar stories to how Liverpool were cheated by Inter Milan, or against Inter Milan. So very similar, like bad refereeing, players hurt purposely, things like that. And those type of things, they just kind of shape how Clough viewed the game. Like, he knew that success breeds success. the best way to be successful is to be successful. But if you need that little bit of extra, don't ever let the pain of a bad defeat or the wronging of a bad refereeing performance slip from your mind. Always carry them with you, because there will come a time where you need to dig a bit deeper and remember that sort of sorrow. And he's then able to project that across to his players. And then one of the other things, obviously, that is quite striking is later in the book, when he gets into the topic of Clough's alcoholism. And, it's a very stark reminder. There's chapter 9 is called Walk Around and Booze. And it just starts, I'll just read the first little bit here. Brian Clough drank to celebrate. He drank to lift himself out of a dark corner. He drank because he was bored. He drank to forget. Finally, he drank because he forgot what he was drinking for. He drank whiskey, he drank champagne. Like all alcoholics, he made excuses and specialized in evasions. He snatched at chances to drink when he thought no one would notice. And as time went on, he drank surreptitiously because he knew he had to hide his drinking, or at best, disguise how much alcohol he was pouring into his system. And that's a very kind of dark introduction to a chapter about a man that, was held in such high regard. And everybody knew that he had a drinking problem, but nobody really knew the extent of it, other than obviously those that were close to him, like his family may well have known. Likely his players had a fair idea. As with most alcoholics, he thinks he's hiding it, but he's only really lying to himself, because everybody knows. Like, it's very rare that there's an alcoholic who's the people close to him aren't aware that they're an alcoholic. They will know before he knows. Yes. So Clough knew he was an alcoholic, but in all likelihood, his wife, his kids, they probably knew before him, but he thought he was hiding it from them. And Hamilton just removes the veil, just goes straight in, and he's very open about it. Brian Clough drank because Brian Clough liked to drink. It's as simple as that. And that's sort of it. When we talked at the start about the statements Clough made at Hillsborough, and you read something like that and you think, we've all known somebody, especially us being Irish, everybody in Ireland knows at least one alcoholic. It's just how it is. And we've all seen people say things and do things they didn't mean because they're gripped by addiction. And it does really sort of make you take a step back and think, right, this is how he was when he was working. By the time he made those statements about Hillsborough, he hadn't been working. Imagine what he was doing when he didn't have the distraction of actually having to go to work, when he was just sat at home with nothing else to do other than wait to go to bed. So what are you going to do? You might as well fill your day with drink. That's how Clough will have looked at it. And that does then sort of frame the view of what he had to say.
Yeah, and you've teed me up beautifully for the last little piece that I wanted to read, because again, it contextualizes, it brings us round full circle. We started off with some pretty negative stuff, and there is a rounded character here that's introduced to us by Hamilton, who, just to follow on from what you were saying, sort of refers to at one stage how he's probably even, well, it was in another review, he was probably even closer to Clough than his family was, and absolutely was aware of the extent of his issue. And he has a lovely passage here that I just want to read to you again, and that we might finish on this and give you a last word in a second. And he's talking about the beginning of his time. He says, "So it began, an extraordinary journey with a contradictory Chinese box of a man, idiosyncratic, eccentric, wholly unpredictable from one blink of an eye to the next, and unfathomably difficult to burrow to the core of. I saw him at his very best and at his very worst. On the one hand, Clough was capable of being unforgivably rude, unnecessarily cruel, appallingly bombastic and arrogant, and so downright awkward that I wanted to drop something large and heavy on his big head. On the other hand, he could be extravagantly generous, emollient and warm, ridiculously kind and loyal to whoever he thought warranted it. And he often went out of his way to be no bother to anybody. Ken Smales, Forest Secretary, said that Clough could be like a sheep in wolf's clothing or a wolf in sheep's clothing, but that mostly he was just himself. A description which perfectly encapsulated my problem in the minute or two before our daily meetings, which Brian Clough was going to turn up. Flowers were sent as routinely as other people posted greeting cards. Friends found gambling debts, mortgage arrears, and bills paid anonymously. Even strangers, if he got to hear about their plight and regarded it as unjust, might find themselves bailed out of financial difficulty. He did it quietly and on the strict understanding that there would be no publicity involved. I stammered, sometimes badly. One morning, forcing out a question took me longer than usual. "Young man," he said impatiently, "do you stammer with me or do you stammer with everyone?" I told him boldly and with no hesitation in my voice that he shouldn't feel privileged because I stammered to all and sundry. "What's the cure?" he asked. I said there wasn't one. Once a stammerer, nearly always a stammerer. He pressed on. "When do you stammer the most?" I said that talking on the phone was always difficult because you couldn't use the natural pauses that punctuate face-to-face conversation to your advantage. "I'll phone you every day for 2 weeks, he said. "We'll crack this." He almost kept his word. My stammer didn't vanish, but it gradually became less severe. When he was at his worst, and especially when drinking brought out the darker side of his personality, covering Forrest was like being ordered around at gunpoint. All the same, I followed Clough with the growing astonishment that Boswell must have felt walking with Johnson across the Western Isles. What Boswell said about Johnson also fitted Clough to a T. He had a great ambition to excel, and a jealous independence of spirit and impetuosity of temper. Not much he did. Yeah, an interesting man, Dave. A really good book about a fascinating character. And an absolutely, I think, belting addition to our series here. Last word to you, man.
Yeah, I think, we talked about how this man was finished in management by 58, but his story as a manager had been largely told over a decade before that. I mean, when he was winning his European Cups in his late 40s. And as I compared him to Jose Mourinho, Mourinho's the closest that we will have seen the entire career of to Clough, in terms of the persona and being the biggest star in the room. Mourinho's 59 now, and he's still going strong. And you wouldn't think of Mourinho as an old manager, and he started like Clough very, very young. So, it just does show you how quickly he did sort of flame out. That he burnt that really brightly, and then, in his 50s, he was almost an afterthought for a lot of people. Those 2 late League Cups didn't really change that for people. But when you think of his legacy, and obviously what he did at Forest is amazing, but it's not just what he did for the clubs. It's what you've just mentioned about how he would help out anybody. And there's a great quote from him when he was accused of being a champagne socialist as opposed to a real socialist. He said, "Of course I'm a champagne socialist, but the difference between me and a good Tory is he keeps his money while I share mine." And I do think that speaks volumes. And what also speaks volumes of the man is there is a statue located in the middle of Nottingham for him. There is a statue located in the middle of Middlesbrough for him. And there is a statue outside Pride Park in Derby of him and Peter Taylor. So that's a man that's had a massive effect on 3 cities, all of whom have honoured him. The main stand at the City Ground is named in his honour. And we mentioned Peter Taylor, and it's important to mention this. How many assistant managers have a statue? How many assistant managers have a stand? The stand that looks directly across at the Brian Clough stand is the Peter Taylor stand. The statue at Derby is the 2 of them. And it is such a shame that the relationship ended the way it did. And I would imagine that when Peter Taylor died, whatever bit of Clough was still clinging to normality, whatever bit of him was fighting the addiction, I would imagine that just dissipated when Peter Taylor died. And it is notable that the last thing Brian Clough won was the League Cup in 1990, and then Peter Taylor died later that year. And Clough went off the rails, went off a cliff. As you said, he was a shell of a man. By the time the Premier League rolled around, and Liverpool-Nottingham Forest is the first game ever televised, the Premier League, and there's, you can go and watch the highlights of it on YouTube, and you can look at Brian Clough, and he is an old, beaten drunkard sitting in a dugout. He is not the same guy at all. It ended. Whatever fight he had left, that took it away. And obviously the last decade of his life was very, very difficult. He had a liver transplant, and then obviously he got stomach cancer, and that's what eventually took him. But Brian Clough's legacy is unmatched as a manager. Like, what he accomplished at Derby and at Forest is incredible, but his legacy as a human being shouldn't be remembered for comments made about Hillsborough. It should be remembered more for how much he helped people, the impact he had on people's lives, the impact he had on clubs and cities, and the fact that while it would have been very easy for him to just never back down, never retract the statements, never, say, I was wrong, he did. And I think that showed, and he did when he probably lost some of his sharpness and stuff, later in life, because he'd been so sick for so long, and drink just takes a great toll, even when you stop. Like, the fact that he was willing to come out and say, I was wrong, I think that's something we should all remember. He did that towards the end. And while it doesn't make up for what he said, it was his way of apologizing for what he said. And, maybe it is time for Liverpool fans of a certain generation to put that to one side, because there's no good in carrying that anymore. And just look at what the man did as a manager and as a man when he had his faculties about him before the badness took hold. Like, this was a sensational one-off of whom they broke the mold after he was born. After Brian Clough, it was just, for an English character, there was never anything like him.
100% agree, and that was our chat about Provided You Don't Kiss Me, 20 Years with Brian Clough by Duncan Hamilton. And Dave and I will be back probably sooner than you might think with a little chat about our fellow countryman Eamon Dunphy and his book Only a Game. Keep an eye out for that one and get your ear holes around it when it pops out. So on behalf of Dave Hendrick and myself, Trev Downey, thanks very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.